We're going to go into the text that I usually preach on the first Sunday of Lent, and I skipped it this year for a reason, but we're going to come back and pick it up now. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell this story. Mark's version of it is rather abbreviated, but Matthew and Luke both tell it in pretty much the same way, so most of you are familiar with it. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. And the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to be loaves of bread." And Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you. And on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." And Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to him, "All these I will give to you if you will fall down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This past Monday, I was in a meeting down in Austin with a group of clergy and lay leaders in United Methodism. And we were with Gil Rendell, who is probably the premier consultant these days, especially in United Methodism, quite a brilliant man. And Gil has become a good friend. He has great insights. And we were talking about the kinds of things we've talked about lately here in this congregation, the headwinds that we are up against in terms of the Christian faith, not just the Methodist Church, but the whole Christian faith. The growing secularism, the increasing number of nuns who say, I believe in God, but I don't affiliate with any denomination. The increasing numbers of agnostics and atheists. And Gil Rendell made this statement: "Do you suppose that it is possible that God has us exactly where he wants us to be?" Exactly where he wants us to be. In the wilderness, in a time of transition. Whenever you see that number 40 in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, either one, doesn't make any difference. You know that it is a symbolic number referring to a time of transition. In this case, these 40 days and nights may not even be exactly 40 days and nights. It's a time of transition for Jesus, just as the 40 years in the wilderness was for the Hebrews. And so this is an important text for us as we move into the season of Lent. And when we think about Jesus being in the wilderness, one of the questions that arises is, was it God or was it Satan that drove Jesus into the wilderness? 2 weeks ago, Alexandra preached a wonderful sermon on this text at the Wednesday night service, these services which I love, by the way. And she raised that question, you need to read this carefully. Was it God or Satan that drove Jesus into the wilderness? If you just kind of read through quickly and you start thinking back, you might think that it was Satan that drove Jesus into the wilderness, because it was Satan that was there with him, tempting him all the time. But if you go back and read carefully, it's absolutely clear that it was the Spirit of God that drove Jesus into the wilderness. In all the texts, Jesus rises from the baptismal waters. John is baptized. He rises from the baptismal waters, and the Spirit sends him immediately into the wilderness. And why is it? I think if you were to ask me to name the 3 or 4 most important stories in all of the 4 of the Gospels, in terms of the life of Jesus, this would be one of them. Obviously, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the birth, maybe the baptism in this one, because it is in this story that Jesus makes the conscious decision to become who God wants him to be, to become fully human, fully vulnerable, just as you and I. And so let's take just a moment and look at these 3 important temptations. The first temptation was the temptation to turn stones into bread. Stop and think about it. It was the temptation to materialism, to give people exactly what they want, which is bread, which is material things. When I was 16 years old, I read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. I think that may have been the last Russian novel I read. And if you've ever read one, you know the reason is simple. You have to read halfway through, at least the first time. You have to read halfway through to figure out who the characters are, because there are all these Russian nicknames for the main characters, and you just get so lost and confused. I mean, it's just extremely difficult. It's a long novel. But I'll always remember that famous section called the Grand Inquisitor. And the Grand Inquisitor gets Jesus and he sits him down in front of him and he accuses him. And the first accusation is, why didn't you turn stones into bread? After all, that's all people want. People are starving and that's all people want. And had you turned stones into bread, they would have all followed you. They would have all followed you. The second temptation is the temptation to power. Satan takes Jesus to the top of a mountain and he shows him all the kingdoms of the world and he says, look, if you'll just bow down and worship me, I will give you all of these kingdoms. The temptation to power. And Jesus says, no, I'll be fully human rather than fully divine. And then finally, the greatest temptation of all, the temptation to immortality, to be like God. Satan says, Jesus, it's written in the Old Testament that God will protect you. Climb to the top of the temple and jump off from the pinnacle and show people that God will save you. The temptation to immortality, and you know Jesus was tempted because later on in the gospel we see him in the Garden of Gethsemane on his knees praying, dear God, let this cup pass from me. If there's anything that Jesus wanted is what you and I want, Jesus didn't want to die. He surely didn't want to die a painful death upon the cross. The temptation to be like God. The great interpreter of Jesus, of who Jesus was as the Christ, was St. Paul. St. Paul was a brilliant, brilliant theologian, especially when it comes to what theologians call his Christology. Paul figured out the Christology of Jesus, and that is what he was doing with his work on earth. And there's a particular passage that's extremely important. We'll put it up here. It's from Paul's letter to the Philippians. This is a section called the Christ Hymn. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I want to read it for you. Paul says, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself of his divinity. Catching this? Emptied himself of his divinity, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient, even to the point of death, death on a cross. That's why this passage is important, isn't it? This 40 days in the wilderness. Ultimately, it is the place where Jesus makes the decision that though he was born fully God, to empty himself of his divinity and to become fully human, even to the point of suffering death upon the cross. And so let's talk for a minute about these 40 days of Lent that you and I practice. These 40 days and nights that we spend in the wilderness. Because the truth is, and we very rarely think about it in terms of this passage, but the truth is, we come to the wilderness because we face exactly the same temptations, do we not? The temptation to materialism. You can read through the Bible, and for the most part, I think you can find that there's nothing wrong with making money or living in a nice home or having lots of nice possessions. But the temptation in our time is to materialism, and that is to define ourselves by what we have rather than who we are. To somehow believe that our value is linked to how much we have rather than to the fact that we are a simple child of God. And don't think we're not all tempted by the sin of materialism. Again, nothing wrong with having things. It's the temptation to believe that things are what decide and define the quality of our lives. And then there is that temptation to power. I don't think everybody is tempted by power, but a lot of people are tempted by power. The desire for one person to have power over another person. The desire for one group of people to have power over another group of people. It starts in junior high school, doesn't it? If not before. The desire for one nation to have power over another nation. It is one of the great temptations of our time, isn't it? The temptation to power. And then finally, the temptation to immortality, the temptation to be like God. To be like God. When you read this Philippians passage in the full context, Paul makes reference to Adam. He doesn't call him Adam, he calls him the first man. But this is what Paul says. He says, Jesus, who was made fully divine from the very beginning, emptied himself of his divinity in order to become fully human. Whereas Adam was made fully human, reached for divinity. And that was the original sin. That was the original sin. Think about this story for a minute, if you will. Adam and Eve are there in the garden. Everything's going really well. And the snake pops up and says, why don't you eat some fruit of the tree of knowledge? There was the tree of immortality there. It wasn't the tree of immortality that the snake tempted them to. He said, eat of the tree of knowledge. And Eve says, no. That's the one tree that God said we couldn't eat the fruit of. The tree of knowledge. And you know what the snake says? The snake says, Shah. He says, God just doesn't want you to eat of it because he knows that if you eat of this tree, you will be like God. You will be like God. That was the one temptation they could not resist. The temptation that we have to materialism, to power, and the temptation to believe that somehow we are like God or that we are better than other people. It's the sin that plagues us the most as Christians, isn't it? The temptation. As Christians, to somehow believe that we are closer to God than someone else is. To somehow believe that we are more righteous than someone else is. To somehow believe that we are going to heaven when others are not. How would we ever calculate the damage that has been done to our faith by those, mostly preachers, who stand in the public square and condemn others to hell just because they don't believe exactly the way they do, when it is explicitly forbidden by the Bible? That judgment is reserved to God and God alone. God alone. So here we find ourselves in the wilderness, our 40 days and nights in the wilderness, confronting the same temptations that Jesus confronted, the temptation to materialism, to power, and to act like God. I wonder if it could be true that God has us exactly where he needs us to be.